February 8, 1945, the Siegfried Line. Germany. The morning fog clung to the concrete teeth of Germany's greatest fortress like a shroud over a tomb. In the pre-dawn darkness of a bitter February morning along the Siegfried Line, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber pressed his face against the narrow observation slit of Bunker Complex 17. Watching American forces move like shadows across the frozen landscape beyond the thick concrete walls, reinforced with steel and engineered to withstand any artillery barrage the world had ever seen, surrounded him with their cold embrace. These weren't mere bunkers, they were monuments to German engineering. Castles of reinforced concrete that had never fallen to enemy fire. Weber adjusted his Feldgrau collar against the biting cold and allowed himself a moment of bitter satisfaction. The Americans had been hammering at the Siegfried Line for months now, their conventional artillery rounds bouncing off the concrete like pebbles against a cathedral wall. Yesterday, intelligence reports had filtered down through the chain of command about some new American supergun, a massive artillery piece the size of a locomotive that supposedly fired shells weighing as much as 3 grown men. The veteran defenders had shared dark laughter at the report's Americanish propaganda. They called it another desperate Allied attempt to break German morale with fantastic tales of wonder weapons. For 3 months, Weber and his comrades had watched American 155mm shells crater the earth around their positions, leaving the bunkers themselves unmarked and unbroken. The thick concrete absorbed the impacts like a mountain, absorbing raindrops inside these fortifications. Heated by efficient German engineering and stocked with weeks of supplies, the defenders felt untouchable. The Siegfried Line had been built specifically to stop the kind of conventional artillery the Americans had thrown at them since September. Every calculation, every angle, every thickness of reinforced concrete had been designed to render enemy artillery impotent against German defensive engineering. But what Klaus Weber and his fellow defenders could not have known, what no German intelligence officer had accurately calculated, was that 20 kilometers behind American lines, crews were methodically assembling something that would redefine the very concept of artillery warfare. They were positioning a weapon so massive, so devastating in its capabilities, that it would not merely breach the Siegfried Line, it would erase it from existence. One bunker at a time, leaving behind only smoking craters where Germany's most impregnable fortifications had stood moments before the 240mm Howitzer M1, nicknamed the Black Dragon by its American crews, represented more than just an escalation. In artillery, it embodied the industrial and technological supremacy of a nation that had transformed its entire economy into an instrument of war, while German forces were learning to make do with dwindling resources and improvise solutions. American factories were producing artillery pieces that fired shells weighing 360 pounds with precision, accuracy across distances of nearly 15 miles. Each shell contained enough high explosive to level a city block, and the howitzer could place these massive projectiles with surgical precision against targets that conventional artillery could barely scratch. The psychological foundation upon which German defensive strategy rested was about to be shattered as completely as the concrete and steel of their supposedly impregnable bunkers the moment that first 240mm shell screamed through the winter air toward Bunker Complex 17 would mark not just the beginning of the end for the Siegfried Line, but the dawn of a new era in warfare, one where no fortification, no matter how massive or cleverly designed, could provide sanctuary against the overwhelming industrial might of American artillery. For centuries, military engineers had operated under the assumption that with sufficient concrete, steel, and strategic positioning, they could create defensive positions capable of withstanding any assault. The 240mm howitzer was about to prove that assumption fatally wrong, demonstrating that American industrial capacity could produce weapons capable of obliterating even the most sophisticated fortifications with mathematical precision. The war was entering its final phase. And the Black Dragon was about to announce that phase with a voice that would echo across the German countryside, like thunder from an angry god. Weber checked his watch. 0547 hours. Sunrise would come soon, and with it, another day of waiting behind. Walls that had never failed to protect him. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last sunrise those walls would ever see intact. And that within hours the very concept of impregnable fortification would become as obsolete as medieval castle walls in the age of gunpowder. The American artillery crews were making their final calculations, adjusting elevation and windage with the precision of watchmakers, preparing to deliver a lesson in modern warfare that would be written in concrete dust and twisted steel across the length of Germany's greatest defensive line. The transformation of military thinking that began with the Industrial Revolution was about to reach its ultimate expression in the form of a single artillery shell weighing more than most men, carrying enough explosive power to excavate a crater large enough to swallow a house, delivered with the accuracy of a surgeon's scalpel across a distance that placed the gunners safely beyond the reach of any possible retaliation. This was not merely warfare. This was industrial might made manifest in the language of high explosives and reinforced steel, speaking with a voice that no concrete wall, however thick, could ignore or withstand. The silence that preceded the first salvo was pregnant with the weight of history itself, as two philosophies of war: German engineering precision versus American industrial abundance, prepared to meet in a collision that would determine not just the fate of individual battles, but the very nature of future warfare. In bunkers across the Siegfried Line, German soldiers continued their routines, maintained their equipment, and trusted in walls that had never been broken, unaware that those walls were about to become historical footnotes in the story of American artillery supremacy, the engineering of absolute defense. The Siegfried Line represented the culmination of German military engineering philosophy, a testament to the belief that sufficient concrete and steel could render any position impregnable, constructed in multiple phases between 1936 and 1940. The line stretched over 390 miles along Germany's western frontier, incorporating more than 18,000 individual fortifications, ranging from simple infantry positions to massive artillery bunkers, capable of housing guns taken from decommissioned battleships. Each major bunker complex was a masterpiece of reinforced concrete construction, with walls often exceeding 8 feet in thickness and designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest artillery pieces then in existence. The engineers who designed these fortifications had studied every lesson of the Great War, analyzing the effectiveness of French fortifications at Verdun and the failures of supposedly impregnable positions when subjected to prolonged artillery bombardment. They had calculated the maximum force that conventional artillery could deliver and built their bunkers to exceed those requirements by comfortable margins. The concrete was specially formulated to absorb and dissipate the shock of exploding shells, while ingenious ventilation systems and underground supply tunnels ensured that defenders could remain in action indefinitely, even under sustained bombardment. What made the Siegfried Line particularly formidable was not just the thickness of its concrete walls, but the integration of natural terrain features with artificial fortification. Bunkers were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire while remaining hidden from direct observation by attacking forces, anti-tank obstacles, cleverly disguised as dragon's teeth, channeled enemy armor into killing zones, where concealed guns could destroy entire formations without exposing the defenders to return fire. The entire system was designed on the principle that time favored the defender, that any attacking force would eventually exhaust itself against fortifications that could not be breached by conventional means. German military doctrine in 1945 still reflected the static warfare mentality that had dominated the Western Front during the previous war. Commanders believed that well-constructed fortifications manned by determined defenders could stop any assault. Provided they were built to withstand the heaviest artillery bombardment the enemy could deliver. This doctrine had served Germany well in Italy, where the Gothic Line and other defensive positions had held up Allied advances for months despite overwhelming enemy superiority in men and equipment. The success of these defensive operations had reinforced German confidence in the effectiveness of concrete fortifications against Allied artillery. The psychological impact of these fortifications on German defenders cannot be overstated. Men who had survived years of warfare on the Eastern Front, who had witnessed the destruction of entire armies and the collapse of seemingly impregnable positions, found reassurance in the massive concrete walls that surrounded them. The bunkers represented not just physical protection, but a tangible manifestation of German engineering superiority and military tradition. To these veterans, the idea that any artillery piece could simply blast through 8 feet of reinforced concrete seemed as fantastical as claims that enemy aircraft could fly through solid rock. Intelligence reports from German sources in early 1945 consistently underestimated American artillery capabilities, partly due to the natural tendency of military organizations to assume that enemy capabilities mirror their own. German artillery, while accurate and well handled, had been limited by resource constraints and the overwhelming demands of the Eastern Front. German officers could not conceive of an enemy possessing artillery pieces that fired shells weighing more than most German artillery pieces themselves weighed in their entirety. The idea that American industrial capacity could produce weapons that dwarfed anything in the German arsenal was dismissed as Allied propaganda designed to undermine German morale. This intellectual blindness to American capabilities extended beyond simple military assessment to encompass a fundamental misunderstanding of how total war had transformed the relationship between industrial capacity and battlefield effectiveness. While German forces were learning to make do with decreasing supplies of everything from ammunition to fuel, American factories were producing artillery shells by the millions, each one manufactured to specifications that ensured consistent performance and devastating effect. The 240 mm howitzer represented not just a single weapon system, but an entire industrial ecosystem dedicated to projecting overwhelming force across vast distances with unprecedented accuracy. The unprecedented confidence of German defenders in their fortifications was reinforced by months of successful resistance to conventional Allied artillery. Time after time, American 155 mm howitzers and British 25-pounders had hammered at the concrete walls without achieving significant damage. The psychological effect of this apparent invulnerability was profound. Defenders began to view their bunkers not just as military positions, but as sanctuaries that could protect them from any weapon the Allies might deploy. This confidence would prove to be one of the most dangerous miscalculations in the history of defensive warfare. German intelligence failed to comprehend was that American military doctrine had evolved beyond the simple application of conventional artillery to encompass the systematic application of overwhelming force through superior technology and unlimited resources. The 240 mm howitzer was not merely a larger version of existing artillery pieces. It represented a qualitative leap in the ability to deliver concentrated destruction against specific targets with surgical precision. Each shell contained enough explosive power to level a multi-story building, and the weapon could place these shells within yards of their intended targets, across distances that placed the gunners beyond the reach of any possible counter-battery fire. The stage was thus set for a confrontation between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare: German reliance on defensive engineering and tactical superiority versus American emphasis on technological innovation and industrial supremacy. The outcome would determine not just the fate of individual battles, but the entire future trajectory of military engineering and fortress design. The age of the impregnable bunker was about to end, not with a whimper of gradual obsolescence, but with the thunderous roar of American artillery delivering lessons in modern warfare that would echo through the concrete dust of shattered fortifications across the entire length of Germany's western frontier, 22 kilometers behind the American lines. In a carefully prepared firing position that had taken nearly 6 hours to construct, the crew of Baker Battery, 697th Field Artillery Battalion, made their final preparations for what would become one of the most decisive artillery strikes in the history of modern warfare. The 240mm howitzer M1 sat like a steel cathedral in the dawn light, its massive barrel elevated at precisely 37 degrees, calculated to deliver its devastating payload directly onto the reinforced concrete roof of Bunker Complex 17. The weapon itself was a testament to American industrial might. 700 pounds of precisely engineered steel capable of hurling a 360-pound high-explosive shell across 14 miles with accuracy that defied the imagination of anyone who had not witnessed its capabilities. First-hand Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, the chief of the gun crew, ran through his checklist with the methodical precision of a man who understood that a single miscalculation could waste months of preparation and hundreds of lives. The mathematics of artillery had become his religion during 3 years of warfare across North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and he approached each shot with the reverence of a high priest conducting a sacred ritual. The firing data had been calculated and recalculated by the battery's Fire Direction Center, cross-checked against meteorological data, wind conditions, and precise survey measurements that located the target bunker to within 3 meters of its actual position. The shell itself represented the culmination of American munitions technology, 360 pounds of precisely manufactured steel filled with Composition B explosive and fitted with a point-detonating fuse designed to ensure maximum explosive effect upon contact with the target, unlike conventional artillery shells, which relied primarily on fragmentation and blast effects. The 240mm round was designed to achieve its destructive power through the sheer magnitude of its explosive content. When detonated, it would release energy equivalent to nearly 200 pounds of TNT in a concentrated burst capable of shattering reinforced concrete and vaporizing steel reinforcement. Bars. The gun crew moved with practiced efficiency through the loading sequence, each man performing his assigned role in a ballet of destruction that had been rehearsed countless times until it became second nature. The shell was loaded using the weapon's hydraulic loading system, followed by the carefully measured propellant charge that would accelerate the projectile to a muzzle velocity of 300 feet per second. The entire process took less than 3 minutes from the moment the firing command was received until the gun was ready to fire, a testament to both the weapon's design and the proficiency of its crew. But what made the 240mm howitzer truly revolutionary was not just its size or destructive power, but the precision with which it could deliver that power across vast distances. American artillery doctrine had evolved far beyond the area bombardment techniques of earlier wars to embrace the concept of precision destruction, the ability to eliminate specific targets with minimal expenditure of ammunition. Each 240mm shell cost more than most soldiers earned in a year. But that single shell could accomplish what hundreds of conventional artillery rounds could not: the complete destruction of a heavily fortified target with mathematical certainty. The psychological impact of the weapon extended beyond its immediate destructive capabilities to encompass what it represented about American industrial and technological supremacy, while German forces were learning to improvise with whatever materials they could scavenge from the ruins of their collapsing war economy. American factories were producing artillery pieces that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. The 240mm howitzer required specialized transportation equipment, precision manufacturing capabilities, and logistical support systems that only a fully mobilized industrial economy could provide on a sustained basis. At 0621 hours, the fire mission was authorized by Division Artillery Command. The coordinates had been confirmed by aerial reconnaissance, photographs taken less than 12 hours earlier, showing Bunker Complex 17 exactly as intelligence. Our EPORTS had described it a massive concrete structure, housing an estimated 30 German soldiers and mounting two 88mm anti-tank guns that had been harassing American supply convoys for the past 6 weeks. The bunker represented everything that was most formidable about German defensive engineering: thick walls, interlocking fields of fire, and a position that seemed utterly invulnerable to conventional attack. Staff Sergeant Chen made his final sight picture, adjusting the gun's elevation to account for the slight crosswind that had developed since the original firing. Solution was computed. The mathematical precision required for long-range artillery fire had always fascinated him. The countless variables that had to be calculated and compensated for in order to place a projectile accurately across such vast distances: air temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, the rotation of the Earth itself, even the slight variations in the weight and dimensions of individual shells. All of these factors had to be integrated into a firing solution that would place the projectile within yards of its intended target. The loading sequence was completed at 0627 hours. The massive shell sat in the chamber like a mechanical prayer, waiting to deliver its message of American industrial supremacy to German defenders who still believed that concrete walls could provide absolute protection. The propellant charge had been precisely measured to deliver the shell to its target with optimal accuracy, while the fuse had been set to detonate upon contact with the bunker's reinforced roof. Everything was ready for what would become a defining moment in the history of artillery warfare. The silence that preceded the firing command seemed to stretch across the entire battlefield like a held breath. In bunkers along the Siegfried Line, German soldiers continued their morning routines, unaware that the mathematics of their destruction had already been calculated with scientific precision. The 240mm howitzer sat motionless in its firing position, a monument to American engineering, waiting to deliver a lesson in modern warfare that would redefine the very concept of fortification. The age of the impregnable bunker was about to end, announced by the roar of a weapon that represented everything most revolutionary about American military technology. At 0629 hours, Staff Sergeant Chen received the firing command through his radio headset. His hand moved to the firing mechanism with the steady precision of a surgeon making a critical incision. The mathematics had been completed, the target verified, the weapon loaded and aimed with mechanical precision. What followed would not be merely an artillery strike, but a demonstration of American industrial might, delivered in the form of 360 pounds of high explosive traveling at twice the speed of sound toward a concrete structure that had never been damaged by enemy fire. The firing command crackled through Staff Sergeant Chen's headset at exactly 0629 hours. Fire mission 1 round, high explosive target, Bunker Complex 17 battery. Fire when ready. Chen's response was immediate and professional. On the way. His hand squeezed the electric firing mechanism, and in that instant, the 240mm howitzer M1 announced the arrival of a new era in warfare with a sound that had never before echoed across any battlefield in human history. The muzzle blast from the Black Dragon was not merely loud, it was apocalyptic. The concussion wave rolled across the landscape like thunder from an angry god, rattling windows in buildings 20 miles away and causing birds to drop dead from the sky within a quarter-mile radius of the gun position. The flash of the exploding propellant charge lit up the dawn sky like a second sunrise. casting stark shadows across the faces of American soldiers who watched in awe as their weapon unleashed its devastating power. The recoil drove the massive gun carriage backwards 6 feet despite its hydraulic recoil system, testament to the enormous forces involved in launching a 360-pound projectile at more than twice the speed of sound for 43 seconds. The shell traced its ballistic arc through the gray February sky, carrying with it the concentrated industrial might of American manufacturing and the accumulated mathematical precision of months of careful preparation. German radar operators along the Siegfried Line detected the incoming projectile, but its size and velocity were so far beyond their experience that initial reports were dismissed as equipment malfunction. No artillery shell in their database matched the radar signature of the incoming 240 millimeters round. It was simply too large and too fast to fit within the parameters of conventional artillery. Fire in Bunker Complex 17. Obergefreiter Weber was heating ersatz coffee over a small electric burner when the first sound reached his ears, a low, growing whistle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unlike the familiar shriek of incoming 155 millimeter shells, this sound was deeper, more ominous, carrying within it an unmistakable note of impending catastrophe. Weber's combat experience told him to take cover, but his rational mind insisted that no artillery shell could penetrate 8 feet of reinforced concrete. The massive walls that surrounded him had weathered months of bombardment without sustaining so much as a crack. The 240 millimeter shell struck the reinforced concrete roof of Bunker Complex 17 at 0630 hours and 13 seconds, traveling at 1,847 feet per second. After completing its 14-mile journey, the point detonating fuse functioned exactly as designed, initiating the explosive train that converted 360 pounds of precisely manufactured steel and high explosive into pure destruction. The detonation released energy equivalent to 200 pounds of TNT in a concentrated burst that lasted less than 1,000th of a second. But in that brief instant, it accomplished what German engineers had believed impossible: the complete obliteration of a bunker designed to withstand any conceivable artillery bombardment. The reinforced concrete roof, 8 feet thick and strengthened with steel reinforcement bars, simply ceased to exist. The explosive force vaporized the concrete in the immediate blast area and hurled chunks of reinforced debris weighing several tons across distances of more than 200 meters. The steel reinforcement bars were not bent or broken, they were transformed into metallic vapor by temperatures that briefly exceeded those found in the interior of stars. The blast wave traveled through the bunker's interior at supersonic speed, creating pressures that liquefied human tissue and turned steel equipment into twisted sculpture. Obergefreiter Weber and his 29 comrades were killed so instantaneously that their nervous systems had no time to register the sensation of dying. Overpressure wave that preceded the blast effects had already rendered them unconscious. Before the main destructive force reached them, death came not as an experience, but as a simple transition from existence to non-existence, accomplished with a thoroughness that left no doubt about the superiority of American artillery technology over German defensive engineering. Crater left by the 240 millimeter shell was a perfect hemisphere 40 feet in diameter and 20 feet deep, excavated in the solid earth with geological precision where Bunker Complex 17 had stood moments before. There was now only a smoking wound in the earth, surrounded by scattered fragments of concrete and twisted steel. The 288 millimeters anti-tank guns that had terrorized American supply convoys were nowhere to be found. They had been atomized along with everything else that had occupied the space where the shell detonated. American forward observers, watching through binoculars from their concealed positions, could hardly believe what they had witnessed. Bunkers that had seemed as permanent as mountains had simply vanished, leaving behind only smoking craters and the scattered debris of what had once been Germany's most formidable defensive engineering. Psychological impact of this demonstration was immediate and profound. If a single American artillery shell could obliterate a bunker that had withstood months of conventional bombardment, then no German position along the entire Siegfried Line could be considered safe. German radio intercepts in the minutes following the strike revealed a level of shock and panic that intelligence officers had never before recorded in enemy communications. Unit commanders reported the complete disappearance of entire bunker complexes, describing craters where heavily fortified positions had existed moments before. The language used in these reports reflected a profound psychological trauma experienced combat veterans, men who had survived years of warfare on multiple fronts, were reduced to incoherent descriptions of destruction that exceeded their ability to process or understand. The single 240 mm shell had accomplished what months of conventional artillery bombardment could not. It had shattered German confidence in their defensive capabilities and demonstrated the overwhelming technological superiority of American military industry. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass broader questions about Germany's ability to continue the war against an enemy possessing such devastating weapons. If American forces could obliterate Germany's most formidable fortifications with single artillery shells, what hope remained for continued resistance? Word of the bunker's destruction spread through German communication networks with the speed of wildfire, carrying with it a psychological payload as devastating as the physical destruction of the target itself. Soldiers who had trusted in concrete walls for protection began to question whether any position could provide safety against American artillery. The myth of the impregnable fortification had been shattered as completely as the bunker itself, leaving German defenders psychologically naked before the advancing tide of American military superiority. The 240 mm howitzer had spoken with a voice that transcended mere military effectiveness to become a symbol of American industrial and technological dominance. Each shell represented not just destructive power, but the accumulated might of factories, laboratories, and engineering expertise that German war production could no longer match. The Black Dragon's roar announced not just the destruction of individual targets, but the beginning of the end for Germany's ability to resist the overwhelming material superiority of American war-making capacity. In the hours following the destruction of Bunker Complex 17, the psychological shockwave rippled through German defensive positions along the entire length of the Siegfried Line. With the inevitability of a natural disaster, radio communications intercepted by American signals intelligence revealed a level of demoralization that exceeded anything previously recorded in German military transmissions. Veterans who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the grinding retreat across Eastern Europe found themselves facing a form of warfare that transcended their understanding of what was possible within the conventional framework of military action. Hauptmann Friedrich Kleist, commanding the bunker complex designated as Strongpoint Bravo 7, received the initial reports with professional skepticism that quickly transformed into desperate concern as confirmation arrived from multiple sources. The language used by surviving German observers defied military protocol in its emotional content. Experienced non-commissioned officers were reporting the complete evaporation of reinforced concrete positions, describing destruction so total that it left no recognizable traces of what had been substantial fortifications moments before the American artillery strike. The methodical nature of the American bombardment plan became apparent as the morning progressed. Rather than engaging in random destruction, the 240 mm howitzers were systematically eliminating specific bunker complexes, according to a predetermined sequence that reflected months of detailed intelligence gathering and tactical analysis. Each target had been selected for maximum psychological impact as well as tactical advantage. Command bunkers, communication centers, and positions that dominated key terrain features were being obliterated with mathematical precision that left no doubt about American intelligence capabilities. At 0745 hours, American artillery observers directed the second 240mm shell towards strongpoint Bravo 7 itself. Hauptmann Kleist had just finished reviewing casualty reports from the morning's action when the familiar whistle announced the approach of another impossibly large projectile. Unlike his subordinates, who scrambled for whatever cover they could find within the bunker's interior, Kleist remained at his observation post, driven by a professional need to witness the destruction of his own position. His final radio transmission, recorded by German communications intercept stations, consisted of a single word: unglitch, impossible. The second 240mm shell achieved results identical to the first, converting 8 feet of reinforced concrete and 37 German soldiers into a smoking crater that obliterated every trace of what had been considered an impregnable defensive position. The blast effects were so complete that American intelligence officers later reported difficulty in determining the exact location where the bunker had stood. The crater was the only evidence that anything had ever occupied the site. Even the steel reinforcement bars that had given the concrete its legendary strength were vaporized by temperatures that briefly exceeded the surface temperature of the sun. German military doctrine, built upon decades of experience in defensive warfare, had no framework for comprehending the level of destruction being delivered by American artillery. The systematic obliteration of bunker complexes that had never been damaged by conventional weapons created a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond immediate tactical concerns. If American forces possessed weapons capable of eliminating any defensive position, regardless of its construction or location, then the entire German strategy of defensive warfare had been rendered obsolete in a single morning. The psychological impact on German defenders was compounded by the precise timing and methodical nature of the American bombardment, rather than delivering a concentrated barrage that would have allowed defenders to attribute their losses to overwhelming numbers. The Americans were demonstrating their ability to eliminate specific targets with surgical precision, using minimal expenditure of ammunition. Each 240mm shell represented a statement of technological superiority that could not be answered by German engineering or tactical innovation. By noon, 7 major bunker complexes along a 12-mile section of the Siegfried Line had been completely eliminated, their locations marked only by smoking craters and scattered debris that bore no resemblance to the massive fortifications that had occupied those positions hours earlier. German casualty reports, transmitted in fragmentary messages that reflected the growing disruption of communication networks, indicated the loss of more than 400 men with no corresponding American casualties. The mathematics of warfare had been fundamentally altered by weapons that could achieve decisive results without exposing their operators to any meaningful risk. American forward observers reported that surviving German defenders were beginning to abandon their positions without orders, unwilling to remain in bunkers that offered no protection against weapons of such devastating power. The psychological foundation of defensive warfare, the belief that prepared positions could provide protection against enemy fire, had been shattered as completely as the concrete walls themselves. German soldiers, who had endured years of combat, were breaking under the strain of facing weapons that transcended their understanding of what was possible within conventional military parameters. The tactical implications of the morning's action extended far beyond the immediate destruction of individual bunker complexes. The systematic elimination of key defensive positions had created gaps in the Siegfried Line that could not be filled by conventional means. American infantry and armor units were already moving forward to exploit these breaches, advancing through areas that had been considered impassable just hours earlier. The 240mm howitzers had not merely destroyed specific targets, They had collapsed the entire defensive structure upon which German resistance depended. Intelligence reports from German prisoners captured during the afternoon revealed the profound psychological trauma inflicted by witnessing the obliteration of positions they had considered absolutely secure. Veterans described feeling naked and exposed. Despite being protected by the same concrete walls that had previously provided complete confidence in their safety, the psychological impact of the 240 mm bombardment had achieved effects that extended far beyond its immediate destructive capabilities. To encompass the complete demoralization of enemy forces, afternoon brought continued demonstration of American artillery supremacy as additional 240 mm howitzers were brought into action along different sections of the front line. Each strike achieved identical results: the complete obliteration of heavily fortified positions that had withstood months of conventional bombardment. The consistency of these results drove home the lesson that German defensive engineering, regardless of its sophistication or the resources invested in its construction, could not provide protection against the concentrated industrial might of American war production. German military communications, intercepted during the evening hours, revealed plans for large-scale evacuation of the Siegfried Line's remaining bunker complexes. Unit commanders who had spent months preparing their positions for prolonged defense were now recommending immediate withdrawal to positions that might offer some protection against weapons of such overwhelming destructive power. The myth of the impregnable bunker had been replaced by the recognition that American artillery could eliminate any fixed fortification with mathematical certainty. Day's action had demonstrated conclusively that the age of fortress warfare was ending, not through gradual evolution, but through the sudden introduction of weapons that rendered all previous defensive calculations meaningless. The 240 mm howitzer represented more than superior firepower. It embodied the technological and industrial supremacy of a nation that could project overwhelming force across vast distances with precision that defied the imagination of anyone who had not witnessed its capabilities firsthand. The concrete graveyards that marked the former positions of the Siegfried Line stood as monuments to the proposition that American industrial might could overcome any obstacle that German engineering could construct. As darkness fell across the Siegfried Line on February 8, 1945, the psychological transformation of the German defensive mindset was already complete. In bunkers that had survived the day's bombardment, soldiers who had awakened that morning confident in their concrete protection now faced the realization that no fortification, regardless of its construction or location, could provide sanctuary against American artillery. The mathematical precision with which the 240 mm howitzers had eliminated specific targets had demonstrated a level of technological superiority that transcended conventional military capabilities to approach the realm of mechanical omnipotenza. General Heinrich Brennan, commanding the 89th Infantry Division responsible for defending this section of the Siegfried Line, found himself confronting a tactical situation that no German military doctrine had anticipated. In a single day, American artillery had eliminated more than 30% of his major defensive positions, accomplishing in hours what months of conventional bombardment had failed to achieve. Casualty reports flowing through his communication channels told a story of destruction so complete that it challenged his understanding of what was possible. Within the framework of conventional warfare, the weapons that had accomplished this destruction were not simply larger versions of conventional artillery pieces. They represented a qualitative leap in military technology that reflected the industrial and scientific superiority of American war production. Each 240 mm shell cost more than the monthly pay of an entire German infantry company. But that single shell could accomplish what no amount of German effort could counter. The economics of warfare had been fundamentally altered by weapons that achieved decisive results through technological supremacy rather than numerical advantage. This industrial ecosystem that supported American military operations extended far beyond the immediate requirements of producing artillery shells to encompass a complete transformation of American society for the purpose of projecting overwhelming force against its enemies. The railroad network that had transported the 240 mm howitzer to its firing position had been expanded and modernized to carry the unprecedented logistics burden of global warfare, the roads over which ammunition trucks delivered their deadly cargo had been constructed using techniques and materials that reflected decades of civil engineering innovation. Applied to military requirements, German prisoners captured during the afternoon, many of them veterans of campaigns in Russia and North Africa, expressed amazement at the quantity and quality of American equipment they observed during their brief captivity. The vehicles that transported them to prisoner of war camps were newer and better maintained than most German military equipment had been even at the beginning of the war. The rations they received exceeded in both quantity and nutritional value the food available to German soldiers in active combat units, even American prisoners' uniforms were manufactured to standards that surpassed German officer clothing. Psychological impact of this material abundance on German prisoners was profound and immediate. Men who had been told that American forces were hastily trained amateurs supported by inferior equipment found themselves confronting evidence of industrial and technological capabilities that exceeded their ability to comprehend. The casual confidence with which American soldiers handled sophisticated weapons and equipment reflected a level of training and material support that German forces had never experienced, even during the early victories of 1940 and 1941. American artillery doctrine, as demonstrated by the precision with which the 240 mm howitzers engaged their targets, reflected a fundamental transformation in the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness. While German forces were learning to make do with whatever resources they could salvage or improvise, American units operated with the assumption that any technical problem could be solved through the application of superior engineering, unlimited manufacturing capacity, the mathematical precision with which artillery fires were calculated and delivered represented the systematic application of scientific methodology to the problem of destroying enemy forces with maximum efficiency. 240 mm howitzer itself was merely the most visible manifestation of an integrated system that included survey teams equipped with precision instruments, meteorological stations that provided real-time atmospheric data, communication networks that could coordinate complex fire missions across vast distances, and transportation systems capable of moving massive quantities of ammunition over global distances. Each component of this system reflected the same commitment to technological excellence and industrial abundance that characterized American war production in all its aspects. German military leaders, analyzing intelligence reports about American artillery capabilities, found themselves confronting evidence of technological superiority so overwhelming that it challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of modern warfare. The resources invested in producing a single 240 mm shell exceeded the total artillery ammunition budget for entire German divisions. The precision with which these shells were delivered to their targets reflected manufacturing tolerances and quality control, procedures that German industry could no longer achieve even under ideal conditions. Can of tomato soup that Chun had shared with Johnson came from a factory that employed the same mass production techniques that had been adapted to manufacture artillery shells, aircraft engines, and electronic equipment for the American war effort. The standardization and quality control that ensured consistent taste and nutritional value in processed food also guaranteed that 240 mm shells would perform exactly as designed when fired at targets 14 miles away. This integration of civilian and military production reflected a level of industrial mobilization that German planners had not believed possible within democratic political systems. The evening meal consumed, by American artillery crews that night included meat from cattle raised on mechanized farms in Kansas, vegetables preserved using industrial processes developed in American research laboratories, and bread made from grain harvested by machinery that represented the latest developments in agricultural engineering. The same transportation networks that delivered this food to soldiers in combat also carried the raw materials and finished products that supported the entire American war effort. The industrial abundance that fed American forces also armed them with weapons that German industry could not match and equipped them with supplies that German logistics could not provide. As German intelligence officers compiled reports about the day's action, they were forced to confront the reality that American industrial capacity had reached levels that rendered conventional military calculations meaningless. The 240mm howitzer represented not just superior firepower, but the application of unlimited resources to the problem of projecting overwhelming force across vast distances with mathematical precision. Democracy of destruction that American artillery had demonstrated on the Siegfried Line reflected the successful mobilization of an entire industrial society for the purpose of achieving military victory through technological supremacy rather than human sacrifice. The morning of February 9, 1945, dawned over a Siegfried Line transformed beyond recognition, where massive concrete bunkers had dominated key terrain features just 24 hours earlier. Only smoking craters remained as testament to the precision and devastating power of American artillery. The psychological landscape of German defensive warfare had been as thoroughly obliterated as the physical fortifications, leaving survivors to confront a reality in which no position, regardless of its construction or strategic importance, could provide protection against weapons that transcended conventional military parameters. In the command bunker of Army Group West, field reports arrived throughout the morning detailing the systematic destruction of defensive positions that had been considered impregnable. General der Infanterie Gustav von Zanden, reading these reports with growing dismay, recognized that the events of the previous day represented more than tactical defeat. They marked the end of an era in which German engineering and tactical superiority could compensate for enemy advantages in resources and industrial capacity. The mathematics of warfare had been permanently altered by weapons that achieved decisive results through technological supremacy rather than human courage or tactical innovation. American forces, advancing through the breaches created by 240mm howitzer fire, encountered minimal resistance from German defenders who had witnessed the obliteration of their most formidable positions. Intelligence reports from captured prisoners revealed a level of demoralization that exceeded anything previously recorded in German military communications. Veterans who had maintained morale through years of increasingly desperate circumstances found themselves psychologically incapable of resistance against an enemy possessing weapons of such overwhelming destructive power. The strategic implications of the Siegfried Line's collapse extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass broader questions about Germany's ability to continue organized resistance. The defensive strategy that had enabled German forces to extract maximum casualties from Allied advances had been rendered obsolete by weapons that could eliminate any fortified position with mathematical precision. The time and resources invested in constructing elaborate defensive works now represented not military assets but historical curiosities, rendered meaningless by the simple expedient of American industrial supremacy. The 240mm howitzer had accomplished more than the destruction of specific military targets. It had demonstrated the futility of resistance against an enemy whose technological capabilities exceeded German comprehension. Each shell fired represented not just destructive power, but the accumulated might of American factories, research laboratories, and engineering expertise applied to the cause problem of projecting overwhelming force across vast distances. The sound of the Black Dragon's roar had announced the dawn of a new era in which industrial capacity, rather than tactical skill, would determine the outcome of military conflicts. The transformation, accomplished along the Siegfried Line in less than 24 hours, would reverberate through military thinking for generations to come. Age of fortress warfare had ended not through gradual evolution, but through revolutionary demonstration of weapons that rendered all previous defensive calculations meaningless. The concrete and steel that had formed the backbone of German resistance had been revealed as inadequate against the concentrated industrial might of American war production, leaving defenders to confront the reality that no position could provide sanctuary against such overwhelming technological advantages. German military doctrine, built upon decades of experience in defensive warfare and tactical innovation, lacked any framework for comprehending the level of destruction that American artillery could deliver with such precision and consistency. The systematic obliteration of bunker complexes that had never been damaged by conventional weapons represented a paradigm shift that extended beyond military affairs to encompass the fundamental relationship between industrial capacity and national power. The war had become a contest between competing industrial systems, and the results of that contest were written in the smoking craters that marked the former positions of Germany's most formidable fortifications. Psychological impact on German defenders extended throughout the entire structure of military resistance along the Western Front. If American forces possessed weapons capable of eliminating any fortified position with single artillery shells, delivered with surgical precision, then the entire strategy of defensive warfare had been rendered obsolete. The bunkers that had provided both physical protection and psychological reassurance had been revealed as illusions, leaving defenders exposed to forces they could neither comprehend nor effectively counter through conventional military means. 240 mm howitzer stood as a monument to American technological achievement and industrial supremacy, representing the successful mobilization of an entire democratic society for the purpose of projecting overwhelming military power across global distances. The precision with which these weapons operated reflected not just superior engineering, but the systematic application of scientific methodology to the problem of warfare, supported by manufacturing capabilities that could produce weapons and ammunition to specifications that German industry could no longer achieve under any circumstances. Silence that followed the thunder of American artillery carried within it the sound of history turning. The fortress walls that had defined European warfare for centuries had been shattered by weapons that embodied the industrial might of American democracy, leaving behind only echoes and memories of an age when stone and steel could provide absolute protection. The mathematics of destruction had been rewritten by forces that transcended conventional military understanding, announcing the arrival of a new era in which technological supremacy rather than tactical innovation would determine the fate of nations. In the smoking ruins of what had been Germany's most formidable defensive line, the future of warfare had been written in language of high explosives and precision manufacturing. The Black Dragon had spoken with a voice that no concrete wall could ignore, delivering a lesson in modern military capabilities that would echo through the corridors of military academies and defense ministries for generations to come. The age of the impregnable bunker was over, ended not by gradual obsolescence but by the thunderous announcement that American industrial democracy possessed the power to reshape the very foundations of military conflict through the simple expedient of overwhelming technological superiority applied with mathematical precision and unlimited resources. Ultimate lesson of the Siegfried Line was not merely military but philosophical, that free societies when fully mobilized for warfare, could project power with a precision and devastating effectiveness that exceeded the capabilities of any authoritarian system, regardless of its tactical sophistication or defensive preparations. The democracy of destruction demonstrated by American artillery represented more than superior weapons. It embodied the triumph of industrial innovation and scientific methodology over military tradition and fortified resistance, writing the final chapter in the age of fortress warfare with 360-pound exclamation points delivered across 14 miles of contested terrain with the accuracy of mechanical clockwork and the power of controlled lightning in the end. The Siegfried Line fell not to human courage or tactical brilliance, but to the methodical application of American industrial might expressed through weapons that transformed warfare from an art practiced by soldiers into a science mastered by engineers. The Black Dragon's roar had announced not just the destruction of German fortifications, but the dawn of an age in which technological supremacy would determine the fate of nations, leaving behind only silence where once the thunder of democracy had spoken its final, irrefutable verdict on the mathematics of modern war.